Hello, my name's Celia Halsey, and I'm the heritage researcher working with CW Plus, the charity which supports this hospital. And I've been looking into the 300 years of history and heritage and stories of this amazing hospital. We've been putting together an exhibition which is open in the outpatients department down in the lower ground floor of this hospital. But I want to share with you some of the many photos and stories which we were just not able to fit into that exhibition. And we've discovered fascinating stories, amazing people, inspiring events, and many of it had never been seen before. So I really am pleased to be able to put together an album to share with you. I love looking at albums and discovering the stories behind places like this, because they tell us so much. They tell us where we've come from, they tell us where we're going, they tell us kind of who we are. So I want to share a little bit with you about this incredible hospital and what it is and what it means to the people who work here, and hopefully you'll discover some interesting things along the way. So the hospital was founded just over 300 years ago. It was really founded in 1716, and I want to tell you a little bit about what London was like at that time. Just before the hospital was founded, George I had come to the throne. He was the king who spoke no English, he only spoke German. And the Jacobite rebellions were just about to start rumbling in the background. That was the Old Pretender and Bonnie Prince Charlie. That rumbled on, those problems rumbled on for about another 45 years. But in 1716, Westminster was a very different place. For starters, it was not built up like it is now. Most of it was open fields. A lot of it was very low-lying, and it was prone to flooding, and so it was quite marshy. And as a result, it was actually quite unhealthy. And there was a lot of poverty, a lot of poor people lived. It wasn't a particularly fashionable area, certainly not down by the river. So the hospitals which existed were actually quite a long way away. There was no hospital in the Westminster area, in the city of Westminster at all in 1716. The nearest hospitals were St Bartholomew's, now known as Bart's, which was in the city of London, and then there was St Thomas's in Southwark, but there were no other hospitals. Those two hospitals had been endowed by Henry VIII. They'd actually originally been founded by monasteries, but then when Henry VIII helpfully dissolved the monasteries, they therefore lost the hospitals until they petitioned the king and asked for lands to be endowed so that those hospitals could continue, and so they did to this day. But there were no other hospitals from that time until 1716, when it was realised that really the poor people of Westminster needed their own hospital. So that's the kind of setting that we're in 1716 when our story begins. I'm going to start showing you some pictures from our album, so bear with me a moment and you'll be able to see some pictures. Just a moment. Here we go. So I've called this Stories from the Hospital Albums, 300 Years of Caring. As I say, the hospital began in 1716. It all began in a coffee house. Coffee houses were places where people in the early 18th century met to do business, to discuss. It's where a lot of financial trading went on. They were the fashionable places to be. They were the places where money was being made, fortunes were being made and lost, but it's where men went to do their business. And so in 1716, 4 people met in St Dunstan's coffee house on Fleet Street. One of them was a chap called Henry Hoare, and he was a banker. And then the other 3, one of them was a tavern owner. He owned a tavern in Fleet Street. He was also a member of the Royal Society. No, there wasn't the Royal Society, but they were the vintners. He was one of the members of the Hall of Vintners. And One of them was a clergyman, and one of them was a writer of religious tracts. Now, Henry Hoare, the banker, declared to the others that he came with £10 in his hands, and they wanted to set up a hospital to provide for the poor and needy and distressed people of Westminster. So they decided that they were going to seek subscriptions, and they were going to draw up a proposal which would encourage people to subscribe and donate to this hospital. So the proposal was laid out as a charitable proposal for relieving the sick and needy and other distressed persons. And it was this version of it was printed, as you can see, in 1720. But in 1716, they started gathering supporters. And then after a few years of, well, they started to make good progress, but then curiously, everything stopped for a couple of years, and they reconvened in 1719. In the meantime, that £10 had been spent on relieving the poor people in the debtors' prisons, because there were 4 main areas that these gentlemen wanted to, this gentleman wanted to help. They were the poor, sick people, so they would provide them with food and physic, so that's medicines, and the advice of physicians, surgeons, and nurses as needed. Interestingly, they also wanted to provide a maternity ward, because there were many women who became homeless as soon as they became pregnant, because landlords did not want pregnant women for some reason. So there were many who lost their homes. So they provided a maternity ward. They also wanted to provide for the sick prisoners. Many people languishing in prisons had no one to support them at all, especially when they were sick. And they also wanted to support poor foreigners who were in distress. They met at Greycoat School, which was a charitable school, and they appointed doctors and surgeons and a matron called Jane Alden. Initially, all the patients were outpatients and they were visited at home. But then in 1720, they had just acquired their first building, which had been furnished by charitable donations. There was a Mrs. Green who gave 1 bedstead. And then the charity girls of the Greycoat School provided bed linens and blankets, and an anonymous donor gave 6 mops. So it's very important that they had all that they needed before they opened. And when they did open, the very first patient was a chap called John Kelly, and he was admitted as suffering from evil of the joints and scurvy. He was admitted on the 11th of May in 1720, and he was cured and discharged on the 8th of June. So he did quite well. Within a month, he was better and able to go home. And I'm showing you this picture because to this day, whenever there's a major commemorative service of any kind, and there have been many over the years commemorating different eras of this hospital, in Westminster Abbey, a bowl of oranges is placed on the altar to represent all the patients and the nursing care that goes on within this hospital. And so in 1970, when the hospital was celebrating its 250th anniversary, they gave every patient in the hospital on the 11th of May an orange wrapped in a commemorative paper. And this is a photograph of one of those oranges. I'm sure they were thoroughly enjoyed at the time. And then after a few years, they were able to acquire bigger and better premises until in 1734, they rented 3 adjoining houses. And this is the only picture we have of that hospital in 1734. And I like the little sedan chair going by. That sets the scene nicely. The hospital trustees had actually fallen out quite severely amongst themselves over the positioning or where they should place this 3rd hospital building. And as a result, at the time, quite a lot of the trustees and a lot of the doctors that they'd engaged as well split, and they went off and they actually set up what became St George's Hospital. So something good came out of that difficult time. But the remaining trustees and the remaining doctors continued, and subscriptions continued to flow in, including some royal subscribers and some royal supporters in the form of the Prince of Wales, the future George II. So once they had got themselves established here, they started taking in more patients, and a trustee was somebody who donated 2 guineas a year, so that's £2, 2 shillings a year. And if you were a trustee, that meant you could refer 1 inpatient and 1 outpatient at a time. So they were doing really very well. This began to go from strength to strength. And then an anonymous donor gave £400, a huge sum of money at the time, to enable them to start taking in incurable patients. So people who had no hope of curing, they became residents, if you like, and they were given a uniform and they were given an allowance of food and nursing care. It was like a kind of early nursing home, really. Well, they continued in that position, in that building, for another 100 years, until finally they were able to raise the funds, £40,000, to build the first purpose-built building. This was built on Broad Sanctuary. It's no longer there. It's now the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre. It was built in a rather grand style. It had 3 wards, only 3 wards. It looks as if it ought to be bigger than that, but just 3 wards. It had 150 beds, and each ward had its own toilet. Now, this was revolutionary at the time. The only unfortunate thing was that despite the facilities, they didn't pay enough attention to the drainage. The drains were a constant problem in this building, I understand, and they tried various ways to fix it over the years, but it was always a problem. It became a major teaching hospital. The same year that they moved here, it also set up its first medical school. So for the first time, there were Westminster Hospital trained medics. Now, because of its position, here we are, here's another view of it, right opposite the west door of Westminster Abbey, it developed a really close relationship with the Abbey. And that has continued right up until very recent times. There's a particular link between Westminster nurses and doctors and Westminster Abbey. The position has meant that over the years, it's been the plum spot to observe and watch any royal event going on in Westminster Abbey. So it began with Queen Victoria's coronation. They built these kind of wooden seats, if you like, a kind of structure on the front of the building, so you can see all the people there. This is actually, I think this is, we're not quite sure when this photo was taken, but it looks to me as if it was the coronation of Edward VII in, no, I beg your pardon, of George V in 1910. And you can see all the people sitting in the stalls there watching. And then again, in the coronation of George VI, the nurses got a prime view. You can see them. Can you see they're holding their Union flags? They're looking all very jolly and happy. There's Matron sitting in the middle. She's the lady in the dark dress in the middle, looking sideways. That was in 1936. So it was a really great spot. There are medical students who later recorded at the time, I've got a quote from that they watched the new King and Queen, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, come from the west door, and they saw sunlight strike red shafts of fire from the Black Prince's ruby in the imperial state crown when the King and Queen stood at the top of the steps on leaving the Abbey. That was a moment that stayed with many of those nurses and doctors, having seen that at the time. Well, in 1914, the world was turned upside down by the First World War. And Westminster Hospital, for the first time, really began to feel the impact of that war. actually within its own doors. The hospital was partly taken over by the army. 150 beds were devoted to the care of wounded soldiers returning from the front in France. The medical school was taken over by the Royal Army Medical Corps, where they trained army pathologists. Now, this was quite groundbreaking at the time. And also the voluntary aid detachment nurses, they were known as VADs. They were kind of volunteer women who trained in a very rudimentary way as nurses and were sent off to the front for really quite grueling work on the front line. But they were trained at Westminster Hospital before being sent off to the front. Now, I quite like this picture I'm showing you. It's from the London Illustrated News. And if you look closely, you can just about see a banner over the front door there. And it says Wounded Soldiers, Westminster Hospital, and you can't read what it says underneath. But I think it was a fundraising banner asking people to donate to the welfare of wounded soldiers. And of course, there's the obligatory formal photograph. This is all the nursing and chief medical staff, taken in 1917, this picture. But notice the medical staff are all in uniform, of course. The matron and the chief nursing officers there as well. But we've got two, I think the gentleman on the far right of the screen and the second one in from the left. I think they're naval officers and the rest are in army uniform. Quite a stiff formal photograph, but the nurses look quite smiley and welcoming. I want to tell you a little bit about medical school. It was set up in 1834, the same year that the hospital moved to the site opposite Westminster Abbey. This picture is of a gentleman called George Guthrie, who had an extraordinary life. He was the founding dean, or the founding member really of the medical school. He had set up the medical school a year or two before this under his own name and at his own expense. But the school, he was a doctor at, he was a surgeon actually at Westminster Hospital. And in 1834, the hospital kind of adopted his medical school to become the Westminster Medical School. He was an extraordinary chap. He had been apprenticed aged 13 to the army as what was called an army surgeon's mate. And he worked in an army hospital and then went off to war, aged 14. But the following year, this was the Napoleonic Wars, in 1801, the army decided they weren't going to employ unqualified boys anymore as surgeons' mates. So he had to go and take some exams. So he approached the Royal College of Surgeons, and at 2 days' notice, he took his exams and he passed, and he was 16 years old. He had probably seen it all by being in the army and going off to war. So he was an extraordinary man. He went on to become an army surgeon in the Peninsular Wars, which were in the Napoleonic Wars. And he learnt his trade on the battlefield. He became a hugely eminent eye surgeon. And by the time he returned and in 1823 joined the staff of Westminster Hospital, he was known to be the most preeminent surgeon in England at the time. So he helped set up the medical school, which grew and flourished, went through a few ups and downs. And by 1938, it had its own very grand building built specially for it, which had all sorts of state-of-the-art facilities, including a fabulous new library, and there's one of the medics in 1938, looking very studious. It also had a specimen museum. Now, having this library and this museum meant that for the first time, the medical students could do all their pre-clinical training actually at Westminster Medical School. And this museum of specimens included some specimens which had been gathered from the battlefield by Guthrie himself back in 1814. At the Battle of Toulouse, there were some gunshot wounds which were used by students for many, many years until living memory, as ways for studying anatomy and what gunshot can do to bones. So slightly gruesome, but it was essential training. So just after the medical school was built in 1938, the new splendid building, they began work on a splendid new hospital. This was on St. John's Square. This picture was taken in 1938 when they were still constructing the hospital. This is also state of the art of it for its time. Had 7 stories. What was revolutionary about it was that each ward had its own outpatients department right next to it. So if an outpatient arrived, they could be admitted straight into the correct hospital just across the corridor. In the basement, there was a pioneering new radium treatment center. This is for early treatment of cancer. And on the roof, they built a new pathology lab. And it was opened in 1939 by King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth. And there's a picture of them at the opening in 1936. It was a very exciting day, but of course it was absolutely on the eve of World War II. So this beautiful, sparkling new building found itself suddenly in the thick of the Blitz of World War II. And this time, rather than the wounded soldiers being brought to the hospital, the war itself, of course, arrived in London in the Blitz, and Westminster was absolutely in the thick of it. It became a kind of triage centre. It was a major trauma hospital and a first aid post. It's where a lot of the injured from bombing raids were brought. The most seriously wounded were treated here at Westminster, and those who could be transferred were transferred to other hospitals further out, away from the heart of the danger. This photo was taken when they were they ran a considerable number of were drills, really. So that they're pretending here, but they took a remarkable set of photographs which are very revealing as to how thoroughly streamlined the whole process was for incoming wounded. I like the way communications were around the hospital were conducted by blackboard. No electronic communications then. And one of the young porters with his gas mask got quite artistic, raising the spirits. And he's actually writing there, please bring your gas masks. But I like he's drawing some German bombers and some parachutes coming down. I think he's enjoying himself rather there. But these blackboards were used to make changes of activity, or the way that things were operating in the hospital. If anything changed, they'd write it up on the blackboard. And then in 1940, right at the beginning of the war, Dunkirk, before the Blitz happened actually, Dunkirk was evacuated, and all the little boats rescued thousands and thousands of stranded soldiers, and those who were wounded, many of them ended up in Westminster Hospital. So this was a press photograph taken by a newspaper of some returning Dunkirk soldiers congratulating themselves for getting out safely, and their very relieved looking relatives, wives or mother maybe, looking very pleased to see them. I also want to talk to you about the Children's Hospital. There was a Westminster Children's Hospital which amalgamated with Westminster Hospital from 1947, but it had been founded in 1907, and we found this picture in the archives, which I think is just charming. We think it was the opening of the new building in 1907 for the Infants Hospital. And look at those little tots in their cots. It seems to me those cots don't look very safe. They look a bit flimsy, and those children sitting up in them, climb out quite easily, couldn't they? But it's a lovely picture. By the 1930s, the hospital looked a little bit better equipped. They've got slightly safer cots, look. But that was one of the wards in the Children's Hospital in the 1930s. The toy dog sitting in the window there. And this is the building today. It ceased operating in 1992 when Chelsea and Westminster Hospital opened its doors on its current site. But the building itself had been purpose-built, and you see these lovely bay windows. They were to let in as much light as possible into the wards. The previous picture showed those bay windows. But the outside of the building was charming. It was decorated with these bambini, these little blue ceramic plaques all around the building. That's a traditional emblem for sick children. It's been an emblem for sick children since the Renaissance times. The outside of that building, that's a modern day picture, so you can still see them. It was on the corner of Udall Road and Victoria Square. Vincent Square, I beg your pardon, Vincent Square. You can see, actually, we've rescued one of those bambini, taken off the building, and we've had it restored. And if you get a chance to, on the outside, the entrance of one of the children's wards in Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, you can see one of these plaques hanging on the wall today. And here we are in a new era. 1993, it was decided to amalgamate a number of London hospitals who were in the Westminster group, including the Children's Hospital, into the new building that we now occupy. So in 1993, the Queen came to open this building and on Fulham Road. And the old hospital on St. John's Square was turned into flats. But this current hospital has become quite famous for its art. It was recognised right at the beginning. They were building this hospital with all these atriums to flood the building with natural light. But they realised quite quickly that they were huge spaces, and they would lend themselves to both art and colour and anything to lift the spirits. So an extraordinary collection has been built up over recent years from really major artists of our day who have donated time and their works of art to this hospital. And extraordinarily enough, you may not know, but there are 1,300 public works of art on display around the museum today, around the hospital today. And it's one of the largest collections in London of free-to-view public art. So I think that's extraordinary. The Acrobat is perhaps one of the most dramatic things. That work of art actually had to be installed when the hospital was at foundation level. So that was installed even before the building itself in order to get it inside. And that brings us to today. So the end of my album. I've really enjoyed sharing this with you. I hope you have too. I hope you'll look out for the next in my series of albums. The next one is going to be about Westminster in times of conflict and how it's risen to challenges. It's been really lovely chatting with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. See you again soon.